I'd like to welcome you to the vSphere 6 for Administrators course. We're just going to walk you through some introductory components here. First of all, we have 11 different modules, and each of these modules will vary in length. Some are short, some are very long. We're going to kick off with software-defined data center. We're going to do an introduction on virtualization, introduction on cloud, all the various different components that could fit within a software-defined data center before we kick off into installing and managing ESXi. Now, that particular chapter, we're going to spend time looking at what's required in order to perform an installation and installation itself. What do you have to prepare for? What are you going to look at if you're migrating from physical to virtual? We're going to go through the entire setup of the ESXi host. Anything from controlling user access to the host to setting up the NTP server to redundancy in your network. We will not set up a redundant network for management connections. That will come later on when we get to Chapter 4. Once we set up the ESXi host, including playing with SSH, we'll then move on to vCenter. During the vCenter chapter, you're going to spend some time with licensing, go through and understand the installation process, what you do within vCenter, some of the basics. We will not get into any of the major features of it because that will be throughout the rest of the course. We'll be spending 80 to 90% of our time within vCenter. And in order for you to get the best out of this, you need to set up an environment so that you can practice these as well. The settings will not be the same because your environment will be different, but you can still do this. And I'll explain that a little bit when we take a look at how I have our data center set up here during the introduction. Now, during that Chapter 3, we'll also connect an ESXi host to vCenter, and from there we'll start managing it. That network is going to be on the standard virtual switch. We will not get into the distributed switch until later on. We're going to set up an entire environment on the standard virtual switch, including storage. Now, both with networking and storage, we'll also spend some time on how to get the best performance out of the environment. And then we'll move in and we'll install a VM from scratch, look at almost all of the settings associated with a virtual machine. We will learn what settings, when it comes to virtual hardware, add to performance, and which ones might add to security, and which ones you can just ignore. VMware tools, how important is it? Should I use it? Why use it? Chapter 7, we're going to go through distributed switches. We're going to go through all the settings, how you set this up, and then we'll look at all the features available to us. Keep in mind, unless you've purchased Enterprise Plus, or VMware vSAN, or VMware View, you will not have access to the distributed switch. Then we'll move into just some general management. We're going to take a look at vMotion, storage vMotion. We're going to understand how it works, what VMware has built into the settings to improve performance, how you can take advantage of that, when to use it and when not to. We'll also spend time during vSphere management looking at a cluster and distributed resource scheduler, distributed power management. So after we get done with vSphere management, we're going to move into monitoring and performance. We're going to spend a little bit of time with the monitoring tools built into VMware. We're going to take a look at alarms in this chapter. We're going to take a look at particular features you should look at. And then our last two chapters, we're going to look at business continuity, backup, disaster recovery, upgrading, and patch management. All of those are conducive to a properly run environment. How do we set it up? What are our options? What does VMware offer that might be free? What does VMware offer that costs money? We will at least mention some of the third-party tools out there that you might want to investigate. This particular course is intended to cover VMware, how it integrates with hardware. This entire course has been designed so that from start to finish, you can perform your job and you can do it well. Before you even determine whether or not you should attend this class, you got to make sure that you cover the prerequisites. So let's just spend a few minutes talking about what you need to know. Network Plus, or equivalent knowledge. If you do not understand the network, you will struggle, especially when we get to networking and storage connectivity. 2 years experience with Microsoft or Linux servers. If you're going to get the most out of this course, many of the installation components are on a Windows system. It's good to at least be able to get your way around within a Windows server. You do not need to be a Microsoft expert. Same thing with Linux. ESXi is a Linux distro. you should be comfortable with finding your way around, understanding how you change directories, understanding how you run a few of the commands within there. It is good to have basic virtualization and cloud knowledge, because the more experience you've had with vSphere or with virtualization and cloud in general, the more information you're going to retain. The one thing I love about video-based training is that you have the time to stop and research if you're not sure about some background information. What are we talking about here? Our course methodology. Our intention is to give you, the administrator, what you need to know in order to do your job really well from start to finish. I will be explaining why we should use multipathing on storage, why we should be using as few virtual CPUs as possible for every VM, why we do some things, not just how to do them. So we've got lecture and we've got a lot of demo. Our intent here is to pass real world skills. For the most part, we're going to be going through as much as we can while we're in the software. So our data center setup. When we do our demonstrations, I am connecting into a data center that I have use of during this time. I have a terminal server that I'm connecting in, and notice here it says student terminal server, student ESXi host. So I'm going to be performing demonstrations just like if a student was renting our server equipment and going through labs. I have a terminal server I'm connecting into. That terminal server gives me access to an ESXi host and a vCenter. Now, the ESXi host is nested. That means that the ESXi host I'm using is not installed on a physical server. It is a virtual machine, because I want you to see that that is possible so that you can do this from home as well. I've got a vCenter that I'll be making use of. I've got an Active Directory controller that I call a vSAN that has NFS. It has a Microsoft Virtual SAN on it. It's used for AD, of course, and DHCP. And then we also have a storage server. Now, this is a Synology and or an Exenta storage. I utilize both from time to time, but I have access to a standard iSCSI environment that we will access. So you'll see everything start to finish. Now, what about you guys? If you don't have a data center, that doesn't mean you can't do this. You can set this up in Workstation as well. I believe it's Workstation version 9 and above supports passing through of the virtualization technology. So if you have a desktop or a laptop that has virtualization chipset on its CPU, you can do the exact same thing. You can install ESXi host, pass through the virtualization technology, and therefore run Server 2012, Server 2008 64-bit, 64-bit Ubuntu. You can run all of them inside the ESXi host. I've got a laptop that I run an entire setup on. On the ESXi host, I can run an Active Directory, DHCP, I can install other VMs, I can do anything I want. I can even run the vCenter on that ESXi host if I want to. Depends upon how you want to set it up. Get Workstation, and then you can follow through and do these demonstrations so you can practice. 16 gigs of RAM, I believe, is a minimum. Buy yourself an inexpensive SAN that supports vStorage API for array integration. Synology has those. QNAP has those. There's a company called Quad Store. That is a free software-based virtualization product that supports storage APIs from VMware. So you can take your local storage, set up a storage device through a VM that supports storage APIs. It will work, give you a little bit improvement in performance. That's just a few ideas. What's important is that you actually do some of the work.